Burnout is often misunderstood. Most people imagine it beginning with visible fatigue, overwhelming emotional strain, or a collapse in motivation. Emotional exhaustion feels like the most obvious signal. It feels dramatic, noticeable, and disruptive. But in many cases, emotional exhaustion is not the first sign. It emerges later in a process that begins long before fatigue becomes apparent. The early stages of burnout are subtle. They manifest as shifts in cognition, behavior, and internal experience that are easy to overlook. Often, these shifts are mistaken for temporary stress, a bad week, or minor life imbalance. Small irritations feel more prominent. Focus begins to waver. Tasks that were once straightforward require more effort, and mental energy starts to feel more finite than it used to. Before exhaustion sets in, there is often a quiet accumulation of cognitive strain. Thinking becomes less fluid. Decisions take longer to make. Previously, automatic responses demand more mental effort. This cognitive burden is rarely dramatic, but over time it shapes the way someone approaches tasks, interactions, and even rest. Behavioral changes also appear before exhaustion becomes evident. Small habits shift. Social withdrawal may begin subtly. An individual may start declining optional responsibilities, miss casual check-ins with colleagues, or feel less curiosity for activities that were once engaging. Often, these behaviors are rationalized as temporary adjustments, but they are early indicators of strain. Physiological signals are just as important. Sleep may become lighter or more fragmented. Minor aches or tension might persist longer than usual. Appetite, digestion, and energy levels can fluctuate subtly. While these changes are often overlooked, they reveal the body's response to prolonged cognitive and emotional load. The nervous system reacts to chronic activation long before exhaustion is consciously felt. Another early marker is the way performance begins to intertwine with self-perception. Initially, effort and achievement are separate from identity. Success feels satisfying, but minor mistakes are tolerated. As burnout develops, performance starts defining self-worth. Small errors or perceived inefficiencies feel personal rather than situational. This growing connection between identity and output quietly increases pressure and contributes to the eventual emotional fatigue. Relationships begin to shift as well. A person experiencing early burnout may seem less present in conversations, more irritable, or slower to respond to requests. These changes are often subtle, sometimes imperceptible to others. Friends and colleagues may attribute them to a temporary mood or stress. Yet these relational patterns reflect internal strain. Social support diminishes just when it is most needed, subtly accelerating the path toward exhaustion. Motivation and engagement shift gradually. Tasks that once felt meaningful may start to feel less rewarding. Curiosity and initiative wane. The individual may notice a subtle detachment from goals that previously inspired effort. These early motivational changes are not dramatic, but they reflect the mind's adaptation to prolonged cognitive and emotional load. Stress plays a quiet but constant role in these early stages. Unlike acute stress, which can sometimes feel energizing, chronic stress maintains continuous activation in the nervous system. Heart rate, alertness, and physiological arousal remain elevated, making recovery difficult. The body adapts to this ongoing activation, even as cognitive and emotional resources slowly deplete. Often the first observable signal is performance that feels harder to sustain rather than emotional fatigue itself. Individuals maintain outward competence, meeting expectations, and completing tasks, while internal reserves diminish unnoticed. The discrepancy between appearance and internal experience makes emotional exhaustion seem sudden when it eventually appears. Cognitive load, behavioral shifts, physiological stress, and subtle relational changes quietly accumulate. By the time emotional exhaustion emerges, these patterns have often been in place for months. What appears as sudden fatigue is, in fact, the visible tip of a long process of internal adaptation and strain. Understanding burnout in this way reframes expectations. Emotional exhaustion is no longer the starting point. It is a lagging indicator, a consequence of a series of subtle changes that slowly erode cognitive, emotional, and physiological resources. Recognizing the early signs, even if they feel minor, helps to see burnout as a process rather than a sudden collapse. Emotional exhaustion is best understood as a lagging indicator. By the time it becomes noticeable, the individual has often been experiencing early signs for months without realizing it. The progression is gradual. Mental effort, self-monitoring, and the constant push to maintain performance slowly outweigh the perceived reward. Over time, mental resources become depleted. Individuals may feel emotionally flat, struggle to recover after interactions that used to feel manageable, and notice a reduced capacity for empathy or patience. This emotional fatigue emerges not suddenly, but as a consequence of long-term strain. Chronic stress plays a central role in shaping this emotional exhaustion. While acute stress can sometimes feel energizing, prolonged stress maintains a continuous activation in the nervous system. The body's fight-or-flight response stays engaged, and the mind remains alert, making recovery more difficult. Over time, this constant state reduces emotional resilience, and previously manageable challenges start to feel overwhelming. Emotional exhaustion is rarely a sudden collapse. It manifests as persistent depletion, subtle disengagement, and a growing sensitivity to stressors that once felt minor. Another factor is the increasing connection between identity and performance. Early-stage burnout often involves questioning the value of one's work, losing motivation, or noticing that effort feels less meaningful. As the individual continues to perform reliably despite internal strain, performance begins to define self-worth. Success and consistency become linked to identity, and small mistakes start to feel personal rather than situational. This growing identification amplifies emotional strain. Minor setbacks elicit stronger emotional responses, and the psychological weight builds gradually, eventually showing up as exhaustion. Relationships also begin to shift before exhaustion becomes visible. Colleagues, friends, and family may notice reduced engagement, less availability, subtle withdrawal from previously enjoyable interactions, or heightened irritability. These relational changes often go unrecognized or are misattributed to temporary stress or moodiness. Yet, relational strain compounds burnout. When social support decreases, emotional recovery is limited, making exhaustion more likely once the early cognitive and behavioral changes have already drained internal resources. Internal pressures accumulate incrementally. Mental load from constant self-monitoring, emotional investment in outcomes and relationships, the subtle expectations of others, and physiological strain all interact over time. By the time emotional exhaustion surfaces, the person is already carrying a significant invisible weight. What appears as sudden fatigue is actually the culmination of months or years of subtle erosion. Emotional exhaustion feels so overwhelming because it represents the point at which these internal resources are no longer sufficient. Tasks that once felt routine become draining. Previously manageable social interactions feel taxing, and emotions are harder to regulate. What seems sudden is actually the result of prolonged compensation that can no longer be sustained. Energy levels can be misleading. Many individuals on the path to burnout maintain the appearance of competence, completing tasks and meeting expectations. Outwardly, it may seem like they are functioning normally, while internally, Cognitive and emotional resources are quietly depleting. Emotional exhaustion emerges when these compensatory strategies, like heightened focus or reliance on habit, are no longer enough. Even before emotional fatigue is obvious, subtle physiological markers provide clues. Sleep disruptions, mild muscle tension, digestive irregularities, and a slight increase in minor illnesses signal that the body is under persistent stress. These signals are early indicators, often overlooked, that emotional resources are being drained. Cognitive and emotional indicators often precede exhaustion in ways that can be easy to miss. Difficulty concentrating, slower mental processing, decreased problem-solving ability, low frustration tolerance, and a subtle withdrawal from curiosity or initiative all signal that the mind is under strain. Unlike emotional exhaustion, these early signs are gradual and context-specific. They are easy to rationalize as temporary or situational, which is why they are often overlooked until emotional fatigue becomes undeniable. Understanding these early signs matters because it reframes how burnout is perceived. Emotional exhaustion is dramatic and recognizable, but it is the result of months of silent strain. By noticing subtle cognitive, behavioral, relational, and physiological shifts early, it becomes possible to understand the trajectory toward burnout without waiting for the dramatic emotional collapse. In many cases, burnout does not begin with exhaustion. It begins with small disruptions, incremental changes, and subtle pressures that accumulate over time. Emotional fatigue becomes visible only after these pressures have been sustained long enough to deplete reserves. The more awareness there is of these early stages, the more accurately one can reflect on performance, emotional state, and well-being without being surprised by exhaustion when it eventually appears. The trajectory from subtle strain to emotional exhaustion highlights a critical truth. What feels like a sudden burnout episode is often the end point of a long, unnoticed process. Cognitive strain, behavioral changes, physiological stress, relational strain, and identity entanglement gradually converge. Emotional exhaustion emerges as the first overt sign, but it is far from the beginning of the process. By understanding burnout this way, the narrative shifts from a focus on dramatic collapse to an appreciation of subtle accumulation. Each small change, each minor stressor, and each incremental adjustment in performance or identity contributes to a gradual internal weight. Emotional exhaustion is the visible tip of a larger, ongoing process that has been silently reshaping cognition, emotion, physiology, and social dynamics for months. Often, the first signs are invisible even to the individual. Awareness may only emerge when performance, relationships, or emotional regulation start to falter noticeably. By the time emotional exhaustion is recognized, underlying cognitive and behavioral patterns have already been established, and internal resources are significantly depleted. Burnout, therefore, is not a single moment, but a trajectory. Emotional exhaustion is a milestone along this trajectory, a point where the internal strain becomes perceptible and undeniable. Understanding it as a lagging indicator allows a clearer perspective on what precedes it: subtle shifts in thinking, feeling, behavior, and physiology. In many cases, emotional exhaustion seems sudden because it is the first time the cumulative strain becomes impossible to ignore. But in reality, it is the natural outcome of prolonged adaptation to subtle pressures, invisible expectations, and ongoing cognitive and emotional demands. Recognizing this pattern helps reframe how burnout is conceptualized, not as an abrupt collapse, but as the culmination of long-term, often unnoticed, strain. Burnout does not define the entirety of a person's capacity or worth. It is a signal of accumulated strain, not a measure of character. Even subtle signs are meaningful, because they reveal the complexity of the mind and body in response to prolonged demand. Observing them calmly can help to make sense of experience over time. In the end, understanding that emotional exhaustion is rarely the first sign transforms the way burnout is perceived. It shifts the focus from dramatic collapse to the quiet patterns that build beneath the surface. This perspective allows for a more grounded, compassionate view of experience. It highlights that even in the face of strain, awareness and reflection are possible. Even when pressure feels heavy, recognizing the early rhythms of burnout can create a sense of clarity. Noticing, understanding, and reflecting on these patterns allows experience to be acknowledged without judgment. Awareness itself becomes a stabilizing presence.